So what if the secret to making something grow bigger, stronger, and just more resilient is to actually chop off its head?
I mean, it sounds completely counterintuitive, right?
Right?
Like you're just destroying the thing.
Yeah, exactly. But today we're looking at a cultivator who actively destroys in order to create. Someone who takes literal unwanted weeds and turns them into high art. So welcome to the deep dive.
It's such a great topic today. We're really looking at that tension between wild, untamed nature and strict human intent.
Right. Our mission today for you listening is to explore this incredible masterclass in observation and patience, and we're doing it entirely through the lens of one single, highly dedicated journal entry.
It really is a remarkable piece of documentation.
Yeah.
Usually we view gardening as this battle against nature, but this source material frames it more as a delicate dance, like a mix of total surrender and then absolute microcontrol.
That dynamic is so clear right from the jump. The post we're looking at is a blog titled Notes on Gardening, Part 886, From the Wild to the Pot. It was published on May 6, 2026, by a writer named Ang.
And I mean, we just have to pause on that number for a second. Part 886.
I know. I want you all listening to really think about that. This isn't someone who just, bought a couple of succulents on a whim at the grocery store.
Right, this is an encyclopedic daily attunement to a very specific microenvironment. The sheer volume of that documentation tells us we are dealing with a deeply, deeply methodical mind.
Almost 900 dispatches about a single patch of earth. It's essentially a massive data set at this point.
Exactly. Ang isn't just doing yard work. They are compiling a generational study of how human actions interact with the unpredictable forces of nature.
And the entry drops us right into a very specific environmental moment. Ang notes that the weather has finally cleared up after a period of heavy downpours.
Which is an important detail. The weather is completely dictating the cultivator's rhythm here.
Right, because they mention they can finally resume these long pending gardening chores. So the whole story actually begins with surrender. The gardener just has to yield to the storm.
We so often treat our outdoor spaces as like extensions of our living rooms. We think we decide when we use them, but a heavy storm strips away that illusion of control entirely.
You just have to sit inside and watch it happen.
Yeah, torrential rain compacts the soil, it washes away topsoil, and it triggers these chaotic, unchecked surges in plant growth. During a storm, the human simply retreats.
The storm is basically writing this messy, chaotic, rough draft across the landscape, and it's only when the sky clears that the window of opportunity opens for the human to step back in.
And Ang starts with what sounds pretty mundane, right? Just raking and weeding.
Yeah, standard yard work. But based on the context of this massive journal, this isn't just mindless weekend chores, it's really a scouting mission.
Oh, absolutely. Raking away the storm debris reveals the canvas again. And when Ang is weeding, they aren't just blindly ripping out everything that isn't grass.
They're categorizing.
Right. They're evaluating the survivors of the storm to see what might actually be salvaged and brought indoors into the highly controlled environment of a pot.
There's this paradox there that I just find so fascinating. Ang is out in the yard simultaneously destroying and saving.
Ripping up the unwanted elements to assert control, but keeping a really close eye out for tiny, fragile seedlings to protect.
It's exactly like editing a massive, unruly, rough draft of a manuscript. You're slashing through paragraphs with a red pen, deleting all the tangents and the junk.
But you're hunting for that one brilliant, unexpected phrase.
Yes. You find that one brilliant phrase buried in the margin, and you extract it, and suddenly you're building a whole new chapter around it.
That editorial analogy is really strong, especially regarding intent. But biologically, what Ang is doing is selectively shifting the environment for very specific organisms.
Right, so let's talk about the first plant they actually extract from this post-storm chaos. It's a wild seedling of the Singapore Rhododendron.
Right, Melastoma malabathrium.
Ang specifically notes that this is the fourth one they have harvested from the yard so far, so they are actively hunting for this specific wild element.
And because it's still just a tiny seedling, Ang performs a very deliberate physical intervention. They write that they are going to shape the plant by doing something called pinching the tip.
Yeah, the stated goal here is to encourage branching and bushier foliage as it grows. But I'll be honest, my instinct is to protect a baby plant, not snap pieces off of it.
It sounds completely counterproductive to someone unfamiliar with botany, yeah.
If you want a plant to get bigger and bushier, How does severing its primary growing tip achieve that? It feels like you're stunting it at the exact moment it's trying to survive.
I know it looks like sabotage, but it is actually a very precise manipulation of the plant's internal chemistry. Plants operate under this principle called apical dominance.
Apical dominance. Okay, break that down for us.
So the apex, which is that main central stem racing upward, produces a really high concentration of a plant hormone called auxin.
So the plant is basically chemically prioritizing that one single upward shoot.
Precisely. Because in the wild, a plant's primary evolutionary goal is just to outcompete its neighbors for sunlight. It doesn't care about looking nice or bushy.
It just needs to get tall as fast as possible.
Right, so the auxin flows downward from the tip, and it actively suppresses the growth of the lateral buds, those side branches. It keeps them dormant, so all the energy funnels into vertical growth.
Oh, I see. It functions a bit like a really harsh corporate hierarchy.
Huh, how do you mean?
Well, think about an organization where all the resources, the best projects, the entire budget, it's all being aggressively funneled straight to the CEO's office at the very top.
Okay, yeah.
The rest of the company stays pretty thin. The side departments don't get the resources they need to expand. But if you block that vertical path to the CEO, if you pinch the tip, all that internal energy has to go somewhere else.
That captures the redistribution of resources perfectly. When Aang pinches off that top tip, they are physically removing the source of the suppressing auxin.
And without that chemical signal holding them back, the side departments, the lateral buds, finally wake up.
Exactly. The plant's internal energy and nutrients are forced outward. You are fundamentally altering the architectural destiny of the organism, taking it from a spindly vertical tower into a dense, multi-branched shrub.
But what elevates this from just a neat botanical trick is the context Aang provides right after. They don't just do this automatically, they actually reference their own past data.
Right, they direct the reader to see part 841 of the journal.
Yeah. They look at the earlier rhododendrons they potted, and they observe that while the growth was really fast, the plants lacked that dense foliage they actually wanted.
That right there is the essence of the scientific method playing out in a backyard. Aang tested a hypothesis previously, probably just letting the first few seedlings grow uninhibited, and observe the outcome.
The data showed that fast growth did not equal quality growth for their specific goals.
Exactly. So for specimen number 4, they're iterating. They're introducing this pinching technique early to correct the structural shortcomings of the past experiments.
It's an intense micro level of control to get a specific physical result, but that shift from just observing to actively molding leads us to the second plant Aang harvests.
And the second plant is where things get really philosophically interesting.
Right, because if pinching can change a plant's physical shape, this next move asks a much deeper question like, can a human's perspective change a plant's entire identity?
It really is a fascinating shift in how we assign value to things in nature.
So Aang finds another seedling out in the yard, but this one is completely unidentified. They even say they'll save the official ID for a future post.
But they do record how it got there. It arrived via wind propagation, meaning a seed literally just blew in on the breeze and germinated by pure chance.
And crucially, Aang describes it as a plant that, quote, many would consider a weed.
Which is perhaps the most subjective word in all of agriculture, honestly.
Let's actually define that for a second, because a weed isn't like a botanical family, right? Traditionally, a weed is just a plant growing in a place where a human doesn't want it to grow.
That's the cultural definition.
Yeah.
It's an interruption of our design.
Yeah.
If a beautiful rose bush sprouts right in the middle of a paved driveway, it's a weed.
Right. It's a plant whose virtues either haven't been discovered yet or they're just actively conflicting with what the gardener wants to do.
And most gardeners treat weeds with immediate hostility. The instant instinct is eradication. Rip it out. Throw it away.
But Aang doesn't reach for the compost bin here. Instead, they pause and actually observe this nuisance. They notice two very specific physical traits about this unnamed weed.
Yeah, it grows remarkably fast, and it possesses a strong trunk.
And based solely on those two structural observations, Aang decides to carefully dig it up, put it in a pot, and attempt to mold it into a bonsai.
The leap from a windblown weed to a bonsai subject is just massive. It is the transition from ultimate chaotic surrender to the most extreme form of human control imaginable.
There is a real tension there. You're taking something that arrived by total random chance, a seed tumbling on a storm breeze, fighting to survive in the dirt, and forcing it into a discipline that takes decades to master.
It's a wild shift in context.
But why those two traits? Like, why does growing fast and having a strong trunk suddenly qualify a random weed for bonsai?
To understand that, you have to really look at the mechanics of bonsai. Bonsai is not a species of tree. It is the art of dwarfing and shaping a plant through intense continuous restriction.
Which means doing what exactly?
Well, you are confining the roots to a tiny, shallow pot, which requires regular root pruning. And you are taking copper or aluminum wire and tightly wrapping it around the branches to physically bend them into unnatural angles.
That sounds incredibly stressful for the plant. You're basically breaking its natural inclinations.
It induces a massive amount of physical trauma. Micro tears actually occur in the branches when you wire them. The root system is repeatedly traumatized.
Wow.
Yeah, if you attempt bonsai on a delicate, slow-growing plant, the stress of the training will simply kill it. It won't be able to repair the tissue damage fast enough to survive.
Ah. So the fast growth Eng observed isn't just a nice aesthetic detail, it's a biological prerequisite for the art form.
Exactly. A fast-growing plant has a vigorous metabolism. It can push out new growth and actually heal those micro tears caused by the heavy wiring. It can bounce back from the aggressive root pruning.
And I'm guessing the strong trunk is equally vital for that process.
Totally. A flimsy, weak stem will just snap into the tension of the wire before it ever takes a new shape. A strong trunk provides the necessary anchor to withstand the extreme mechanical forces the artist is going to apply.
That reframes Eng's decision entirely. They didn't just casually throw a weed in a nice pot to be quirky or ironic.
No, not at all.
They looked past the cultural label of weed and read the actual biological engineering of the plant. They saw an organism that was tough enough to survive this brutal, meticulous art form.
Eng is practicing a really profound suspension of prejudice there. Most of us filter our entire environment through labels. If something is labeled a weed, our brain just stops processing its potential.
Right, the label shuts down our curiosity.
But Eng strips away that label and evaluates the raw material. They look at the architecture of the trunk and the vigor of the growth and recognize the foundation for something extraordinary.
It really makes you wonder how many resources or just how much potential we casually discard every single day just because we've applied the wrong label to it. We see a nuisance instead of raw material.
It requires a rare mental flexibility to look at the messy debris of a storm and see a future masterpiece. But as the journal entry makes clear, recognizing the potential is really only the very first step.
Yeah, the actual realization of that potential requires a timeline that kind of defies all our modern expectations.
Which brings us to the end of Eng's entry, and it completely shifts the scale of time we're dealing with.
Yes. So, after potting the rhododendron to see if it bushes out, and potting the weed to begin the long, slow trauma of bonsai training, Eng signs off with this beautiful, almost poetic phrase.
Let's see how this unfolds over the coming moons.
Coming moons. It's such a striking measurement of time, especially in an era defined by milliseconds.
It really is. Think about how you operate on a daily basis.
Yeah.
If you order something online, how many times do you refresh the tracking page to see if it moved?
Oh, constantly. We are so conditioned to expect immediate feedback loops. You send a text, you see the typing bubbles, you get a response, boom.
Right. But Eng is enthusiastically opting into a pursuit where you enact a deliberate physical change on a living organism and you don't even know if it survived the procedure for weeks.
Success and failure are literally measured in lunar cycles. It's wild.
The phrase coming moons perfectly captures the fundamental reality of cultivation. It is a long-term conversation. When you pinch the tip of a plant, it doesn't just instantly sprout side branches like magic.
It has to reroute its internal chemistry, heal the wound, gather nutrients.
Exactly. Eng has initiated a dialogue with the plant, and now Eng just has to wait in silence for the plant to formulate its reply.
And the bonsai is an even longer conversation. You're talking about years, potentially decades, before that wind-blown weed resembles the vision Eng has for it.
Which is why the journal format is so vital to this whole process. Part 886 implies the existence of a Part 887 and a Part 900. Cultivation is not a definitive one-time act.
You don't just place a seed in the dirt, brush off your hands, and say, well, I have cultivated.
No, it's a continuous, endless cycle. You observe the weather, you surrender to the storm, you rake the canvas, you make a microscopic intervention, and then you have the humility to step back and wait for the moon to cycle.
You wait for the coming moons. It is the ultimate antidote to instant gratification.
This entire entry really forces a reevaluation of what it means to be in control. We always think of control as dominance, forcing our will onto an environment instantly.
But Eng shows us that true mastery is actually a hybrid.
Yes. It is knowing when to retreat from the rain, knowing exactly when and where to pinch a microscopic stem, and knowing that after you apply the wire to the bonsai, your only remaining tool is time.
It's so profound. So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's just trace the journey you've taken with us today. We started by looking at a gardener simply doing some post-storm cleanup.
But by treating Eng's journal entry as a masterclass, we uncovered this incredibly complex philosophy.
We watched Eng surrender to the chaos of the weather, only to step in and apply microscopic control by severing the tip of a rhododendron, manipulating its internal hormones based on data from previous journal entries.
And we witnessed a radical redefinition of value. A completely random, wind-propagated weed elevated to the status of high art, not through magic, but because someone actually bothered to analyze its strong trunk and rapid growth rate instead of just dismissing it.
Because being deeply informed about the world isn't just about collecting facts or trivia. It's about adopting new lenses through which to view your own surroundings.
Eng has this remarkable ability to see structural potential where almost everyone else would just see a chore for a Saturday afternoon.
They tore down that rigid fence separating the messy wild from the orderly garden, and they found tremendous value in the chaos.
It challenges all of us to look more closely at our own environments. Because the principles of observation, iteration, and patience, they aren't confined to a terracotta pot. They're cognitive frameworks we can apply to almost any complex system we interact with.
Absolutely. Which leaves you listening with something very real to mull over today. If a literal, unidentified weed blowing blindly in the wind can become a prized, meticulously crafted bonsai simply by being placed in a new context and given careful, deliberate attention.
What weeds in your own life might you be entirely overlooking?
Exactly. Think about it. Maybe it's a distracting habit that drives you crazy, a random hyperfixation you can't seem to shake, or a quirky, chaotic skill that doesn't quite fit the neat parameters of your current job description.
We all have those things we quickly label as nuisances.
But what if those daily nuisances possess a rapid growth rate and a strong trunk? What if they are actually the rugged foundation for something beautiful if you just changed how you cultivated them and gave them a few coming moons to unfold?